Okay, so we're recording now. So let's see here. It's hard to like really put to words specifically what like our shared domain, but it feels like it's actually quite significant, our shared domain. I'm trying to answer this question of how do you have dialogos and how do you do it in a crowd setting? And you're looking at something more like, how can you connect, let's say, different topics and different communities in a way that is, well, decentralized is a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'll let you speak to that. Tell me what your project is about.
Cool. So I guess the thing that we're trying to do more than anything is right now experiment with how do you get small autonomous teams to collaborate across groups, because anything that's a complex problem like climate change, like social justice, like equity, it requires a relatively non-hierarchical collaboration, because anything that's like a simple problem, usually you can have like an organization come together and just like work on it, and it can be a relatively limited number of people and you can usually like do it. But anything that's like a commons problem, inevitably at some point you're going to get to a point where you can't really have hierarchy, whether it's because you're working across organizational boundaries, or you're working across country boundaries, or you're dependent on expertise from people that you just don't have authority over. And so when you run into a complex problem, you have to have a way of collaborating that's not hierarchical.
Okay.
And our little experiment is like asking the question of, okay, so how do we build software infrastructure that supports more distributed, more, you know, there's still centralization aspects to it, but more decentralized ways of working autonomously across groups and then still sort of rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, it's a tough question. And one thing that it brings to mind when you describe this is, it seems like a related question to me. So like what I'm sort of focused on my own little community, but I also am aware that there's communities surrounding it as well. And sometimes it feels like I feel like, how can I go find the others? And on one hand, I think, well, maybe it's just the nature, and we were talking about this over email a little bit, maybe it's the nature of sort of the world we're moving into, that you can only be embedded in a network and you can only see your neighbors, and it's hard to like find all the best groups. But you responded to that and you said, no, you think that actually we have a lot of tools to, even with that like new level of complexity, we have quite a bit of hope in the direction of, would you say, like finding the other communities, coordinating them?
Yeah, so I want to kind of step back just a tiny bit and ask you, like, what made you want to find the others? I'm really fascinated by, because I'll answer that question, like the second question as well, but I'm just curious, what drove you to want to do that?
Yeah, well, a big thing that comes right away is like learning. You know, if I'm trying to do this here and I look at and I see there's this neighboring community doing something very similar, for example, the Stoa is a YouTube channel, and they're doing something extremely similar. And so I would like to, you know, having found them, I can watch what they're doing and can, you know, not only gain more identity for our community and say, oh, they're doing that and we're a little bit different this way, but, you know, just to learn as well. And then maybe to connect and cross-pollinate and stuff like that. So that's a huge, huge part of it, is to learn. And there's also the validation, I suppose. If I can know that other people are trying the same thing, it gives me like reassurance that that there's something to this, and it feels like I'm part of a phenomenon that's greater than just my own little sphere of influence. I mean, I already feel that way to some degree because I'm in a community, But then you can ask the same question about the community. How does the community know that they're not just like a one-off thing? And so it's reassuring to the community that it is not alone as well, and there's others embarking on similar paths, or as you say, maybe rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting because I had the same exact experience with like working with like the 2015 Bernie Sanders like volunteers, and we were all sort of in this Slack. And immediately the first thing I wanted to do was like figure out who was doing what, and like how do we like optimize what we were doing in order to sort of distinguish ourselves and also like be making something useful that someone else wasn't already making.
Yeah.
So I can relate to that a lot. Yeah, so like I just remember our email conversation a little bit, and we were kind of getting to the point of like asking, so are the systems in place getting so complicated, and there's so many groups being formed all the time that we have to sort of just resign ourselves to the fact that it is going to fundamentally be impossible to understand who everyone is and what they're doing? To some extent, yes, right? Because like a group like this right now is a group in a way, like me and you coming together, and it can be very like transient. And there's not necessarily, like if we didn't record it, there's no way to know that we had this conversation or what we learned, or like, you know, it can be very like temporary. And then it's kind of like, fundamentally, you're always gonna have little groups pop up that you can't quite capture. And I think like some of this is also very, very doable. Like I think some of the technologies have gotten sophisticated enough with data science, and like a lot of like marketing companies and advertising related technologies and social media companies are doing this already. Like they have a pretty good understanding of the different ecosystems and what people are talking about and like who's talking to whom, but they're not sharing that with us. So from our perspective, it feels very isolated and like impossible to navigate.
Right.
But I don't think it's actually so impossible, especially because I find a lot of times these little communities are very persistent. Like a lot of times the people I run into in a given theme, they will stay in that theme for a very long time. And then just having even access to that one person will give you access to the rest of the community. Right. So I think like I don't think it's something that we can't do. I think like the data science will be very important in that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So if I could reflect that, you're saying in reality, people are already using data science, or let me phrase it differently. Data science is already being used to analyze these networks and kind of see all the connections and see the topology. And but the problem is that it's generally being used from some central organization to kind of extract maybe ad revenue or some other less than scrupulous purpose. Yeah, that's interesting. And so are you well, first of all, you should probably name your project actually.
Okay, yep. That's a good point. It's SocialRoots, so it's socialroots.io.
Right. And is SocialRoots, I mean, it sounds like data science is at least part of the idea. Is it also part, are you using data science actively right now in what it is, or?
Yes. So there's a few different things that we're trying to kind of turn on its head. One is this kind of, so we're an NSF funded project. So we're funded by the National Science Foundation, Small Business Innovation Research Grant. And we are exploring a few different innovations in this space and kind of trying to push the boundary forward just a little bit. One is fundamentally about that kind of, how do you create software infrastructure for groups that can coordinate more effectively? So that's one question, right? How do you leave people, because fundamentally, like, it seems like we naturally want autonomy and we kind of need autonomy, and we kind of seem to work best when we have autonomy in terms of like what we're doing. Like if you have a YouTube channel, you more or less want to be able to decide what you're going to do with it. And having like having the ability to do that freely gives you more ability to innovate and learn quickly and change and adapt. But at the same time, like if you have no ability to kind of have any kind of infrastructure of cohesion towards a greater understanding of it, whatever you're doing, then you can't really contribute to something bigger. So whatever you're doing will always stay within the context of itself.
Right.
So how do we enable both? Like, how do we enable small groups to have autonomy? And that group could be a group of one, right? Mm-hmm. While still kind of at least having the opportunity to contribute towards something bigger in a way that doesn't necessarily oppress the small group, and it also doesn't slow down the collective.
Right.
So this is like the fundamental question of our research. And then, you know, some of the things that we've sort of thought about so far in terms of like what is it that needs to be in place is like infrastructure, really. Like if you think about it, we've had thousands and thousands of, or I shouldn't say that. I kind of like have a poor ability to like measure scale. So it's probably like thousands, but maybe not quite, of years of like evolution towards like capitalistic markets, right? And there's like incredible amount of value in that. I think market mechanisms can be really influential and meaningful signals towards like what you're doing. Is it useful? Is it not useful? Do people want it? And a relatively objective way to make decisions, but like there's kind of like the additional component to it, which is like, okay, but so you have laws that enable these systems, you have culture that enable these systems, you have educational institutions that enable these systems of like market mechanisms. But we don't really have a lot of infrastructure for like this kind of less centralized coordination. So you could still use market mechanisms to some extent, but they have to be a little bit altered, and they have to be like a little bit just fundamentally enabled. And what we've discovered is the more decentralization you have, the more infrastructure you need to support it. Like you know, people think like, oh, you just have like anarchy and people just do whatever they want. But the truth is, in order to have autonomy, you actually need systemic infrastructure to support it. So then that means you need culture, you need laws, you need software, infrastructure, you need probably lots of other things.
So let me just retrace that, because you started with, it's good. So you started with, I really liked this idea of a small group, which could be one person, but almost whether it's one person or not, it's almost like you're casting it as an individual of some sort. And you could say this individual can be autonomous, but ideally you would want the connection to something larger as well, which, by the way, just makes me think of a lot of metaphors that are really cool, just in terms of like personal development versus saving the world. So that's, but I don't want to dive into that yet, at least not right now, because then you jumped to the idea of a market, and it sounded like part of what you were saying is a market is one way that you can have a bunch of independent agents work together and form sort of a coordination.
But so far mostly in a hierarchy. So all our market mechanisms are strictly hierarchical.
Tell me more about that, because that's where I wanted to ask you about. I want to hear more about that. Like, how is it that a market is deficient in ways that you're looking to address?
And it's not just me, like I think there's a lot of interest in this, like a lot of tech companies and other companies have done a ton of work in trying to think about other ways to structure themselves. Some of them have tried like holacracy, and then there's like a rich history of cooperatives that are, a lot of them very, very, very successful. And some of them are billions and billions of annual revenue generating companies. So I think I'm sort of just like part of this kind of general movement in this direction, which is like a lot of, like, if you think of most corporations right now, the legal structure is you have somebody generally one executive, and then you also have a board of directors, and then you have some people in the executive circle, and then you have the workers. And like, the reason why that's really effective is because generally like hierarchies enable really quick decision making.
Right.
And they simplify the culture and infrastructure needs because you don't really need that much effective communication across layers. You just kind of need information to travel down and kind of sort of go up. And I think that like it's a really, really fantastic mechanism for what it is. And I think the reason it's been so prolific is because it has been really effective. Sure. But as soon as we started to realize, oh, okay, some of the problems we're tackling require by necessity a less hierarchical organizational structure, because you just can't have one corporation that's the whole planet. I mean, I guess you could, but people don't seem to want that.
No. Well, there's like a deficiency in the command and control structure. Something I wanted to say earlier when you were speaking. I think part of what we're talking about is, it's, as you say, it's a good way to, same with a dictatorship, which is like a big corporation in a way where they can make decisions quickly. But then, and maybe this is what you're about to get into, but when a problem becomes complex enough, it's just incapable. It's not the best solution anymore.
Right, because complexity requires a lot of innovation and a lot of adaptation. And hierarchy is not good at that because the information traveling up is so latent.
Right. That gives me goosebumps. That feels so true.
Yeah.
Nice.
So I think some of the things we're even running into with the democratic architectures of some of the nations in the world is that same exact problem. Like even the democratic structures are relatively hierarchical, and the information is not traveling up very easily or very well. And also like the other problem with hierarchies is the incentive structure is really tricky. They're really fragile because like a hierarchy, if you have like a benevolent dictator at the top, is actually kind of the optimal organization. Like if you have like some theoretical person who's just like infinitely wise and infinitely kind and infinitely effective at what they're doing, you know, that is actually the most like optimal way to make decisions quickly, to kind of take care of these things for everyone, and everyone sort of like benefits from it, but like only a few people have to do the work of actually administering the society, right? The trouble is that like that structure is really fragile because like all you have to do is get one person who's not optimally kind and optimally effective and optimally wise, and the whole society falls apart. So like, how do you build more resilience? So one way is to have like the less centralized power structure. The other thing, you know, you lose a little bit of efficiency because you do have a little bit of repetition, but they tend to, because of the repetition, you also tend to have more innovation and more adaptation.
Yeah. And when you were speaking about fragile hierarchies being fragile, another way in which they're fragile is that the hierarchy is built for a specific problem or conception of a problem with certain assumptions. And so, well, when you said, as soon as you get a dictator that's not infinitely wise, things go south. And well, even the perfectly wise dictator today, like tomorrow, his information is out of date. And so just time itself is gonna, and when you said like hierarchies are fragile, that's the first thing that occurred to me, is they're fragile because like just because of entropy. We build this structure with a certain thing in mind, and then, you know, then it's Blockbuster in the face of Netflix, you know, for example.
That's such a good point. Yeah. I hadn't really even thought about that. And then you have this like cost of change is really high.
Yeah.
And when you're dealing with complexity, like complexity by definition is unpredictable and not able, like the difference between, you know, and probably lots of people watching this already know this, but just kind of to reiterate, like the challenges that are not complex but complicated tend to be more robotic, mechanistic. You can sort of, it's like a math problem and you can just solve. But as soon as you get into like more than complicated, when something's complex, you just have these unpredictable variables with unpredictable outcomes. So you can't set up a structure in advance. There's no way to know what that structure should look like in advance.
Yeah, you need something more organic.
Right.
I'm actually glad you said that, because I was just having that thought and I couldn't actually remember the distinction. So I'm glad you brought that up again. I have heard it, but it's like I'm still kind of trying to get it in my head. Yeah, and if the problem's complex, yeah, well, it's just what you said. Maybe I'm just repeating you, but you can't build the structure to solve the problem if it's complex, because part of the solution is to go and try a bunch of stuff and figure it out and be creative.
Right. And then by the time you get there, it might have already changed.
Yeah.
So like the having that kind of maybe slightly less efficient, but more repetitive, like small decentralized structures that are like, maybe have a bunch of smaller autonomous groups working, hopefully in a slightly different way, you know?
Yeah.
But, then you're optimizing your chance of success, because it's more likely that one of those groups will fundamentally end up being the thing that's useful.
Yeah. Yeah, and they can all adapt at the same time. And I think evolution plays a role too, because I mean, if we're imagining at least that because we're kind of talking about, okay, there's this problem out there, like what do you send to solve it? And we're saying, well, a strict hierarchy won't really work if it's complex, because you'll send the hierarchy and it will almost definitely be totally incapable unless you just like hit the jackpot with your design, almost out of luck. And so, but if you can instead send something that's more decentralized, what you just said is like, well, first of all, you have way more chances of success, because you have all these like independent parts, and any one of them can flourish, and then you're off and running. And then maybe the other parts can adapt to that. But then I would add to that, you have this evolution, as long as you allow for sort of, let's say, for the participants to maybe like die and be reborn, or in some way, maybe a more metaphorical way, then even failure doesn't kill the thing. Because if you send a hierarchy at the problem and it fails, you have to build a whole new hierarchy yourself manually, and that takes time and effort. But if you send this more organic kind of collection of entities, and they have room to maneuver, it could just solve itself in a way. The failures and successes that land on the environment of this organic structure you sent out there will actually promote success, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it also kind of leads me to another thought, which I hadn't really thought of before, which is, you know, so our teams sort of have, you know, just a trial and error of working in like less centralized organizations, whether it's like sociocratic or direct democracy, or like some of the, like even the agile teams these days are kind of reflecting these learnings as well. And so that first realization of like, oh, you actually need a lot more infrastructure to support a decentralized way of collaborating, because you need culture. You have to relearn a lot of things that we haven't been taught. And then you also need to like establish the culture based on the team and the circumstance and the goal. So there's like there's this administrative overhead that's really heavy. And then you also have to like have
heavier in a way than assigning a CEO. That would be easy in comparison.
Yeah, you have to like sit there and critically think, okay, but what do we need in this situation? And how does this group actually work with these personalities and this particular problem and this particular task? Yeah, and then like you also need a lot better communication mechanisms in terms of technology. You need like a much more robust set of ways to organize your different discussions and to like um, do like permissions effectively, and to like be able to have flexibility in all these different like infrastructures of communication. What's real time? What's kind of an email kind of thing versus what's like a blog? What's a book? And all of these like communication mechanisms become more critical because like you don't have like a hierarchical institution that just like tells you what to do. So you need these like this infrastructure in place in order to like easily do whatever you need to do in a given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like thought about that as like a huge disincentive. It's like a huge overhead. So like this must be why we don't have more of this kind of structures of organizations. But now that you're like talking about it, like I wonder how much of that is actually like that initial investment, because like if you like build that out to enough of an extent, then it's there and it's just always there. So then when you like try something and fail, you have something to go back to, versus like a hierarchical organization, like you're saying, like they have nothing to go back to. They just kind of have to
Yeah.
go away.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely, I think, a lot of what you were saying, I was connecting it very much to what we're trying to do with our platformed Dialogos community, which is, you were talking about like culture and means of communication. And if you have this decentralization, you necessarily need more infrastructure. And that's what we found. And like I said earlier, I think maybe it was before we started recording, but it's not as simple as putting 30 people in a Zoom room and saying, okay, let's figure out the answer to the question. That doesn't really work very well. And that's an example of lots of decentralization with no culture, no infrastructure. And what we've started, the way we've really started to frame it is, what is the culture of the plenary, which, you know, so when we do a call, we have like, typically go into breakout rooms where you're talking to just a few people, and you go back into the plenary where everyone's all together. So we've talked a lot about the culture of the plenary, and the more we experiment with that, the more constraints we put on the process, but they're helpful constraints, because we all get more out of the process than what we wanted. Or a lot of people are starting to call them training wheels, you know, as we're practicing this particular style of conversation. What are the constraints we put around ourselves to just channel what we really want out of them more? And then also what you were saying about the means of communication, because we have this call every Saturday, but we also have an email thread going. We also have a Discord, and people are also making other groups and sharing polls and stuff. And that, the more of that we can get, it's like the more intelligent we became between you know, on each week. You know, given that we do have a Discord, we do have an email, this and that, like everything you add there makes the evolution from one week to the next even fuller. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And like different people want to communicate in different ways and in different time intervals.
Right.
And it has to be supported, because you can't force them, because you're not in charge. You don't have status-based power. So you just have to sort of enable it. But then by enabling it, you might, this might be what you were kind of pointing to, you might have gotten even more innovation and adaptation and knowledge.
Yeah.
Even though you lost some efficiency.
Right. Yeah, true. So like I might repeat myself in the email thread in the Discord, but not only like by having those both, first of all, you bring more people into the conversation, but also it's just like any platform you use, like compare Reddit to Twitter to Imgur, you know, the constraints of the platform actually changes the way the conversation goes. And so it's the same with email and Discord. With email, people like it because you can have these long form things, and you have a whole different kind of thought process going on than Discord. So, yeah.
So I guess to circle back around to sort of the like theme, you know, my personal belief, right, is that a lot of the problems we're having as a human society globally is we're sort of stuck in this like, okay, I think the technology has finally gotten to the point where we actually can like distribute these sorts of like organizations, like we have communication mediums that are fast enough now to make distributed organizing efficient enough. Like from like between like the internet and social media and like data science that helps us kind of coordinate huge amounts of information all like in a coherent way, we're finally at a point in human history where we can actually like reach efficiency even in a decentralized way if we like put the pieces together correctly, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I think what we're running into is the limits of like the hierarchies and the status-based power that we have really benefited from up until now. Because maybe because of the complexity of the problems you're running into and the urgency of those problems. So like, my personal opinion is like, we need to now solve this next step of like, how do we keep the benefits of these like hierarchical structures while expanding them in order to gain these benefits of adaptation and innovation. And that's a huge challenge because it has so many different facets to it. One is like the laws, right? Like people need to be enabled to invest into smaller groups and like smaller investments into more groups, right? So there's like a lot of securities laws that prevent us from really like investing into on like the crowds investing into it in some kind of way that's actually meaningful. Like you can donate, but you to like buy shares or whatever, you have to be like an accredited investor, which means you have to have like $1 million of assets that don't include the house you live in. And like, it's like this really convoluted process. So like, I'm just kind of ramble about this, but like, that's why like the ICOs were such a big deal. It was because all these different like startup owners were like, I don't want to give all my power to these venture capitalists. I want to retain autonomy, but there were no legal mechanisms for them to do that. And I'm not saying that no one abused it. Lots of people abused it, which is part of the problem. But like,
and just to define the jargon, if anyone doesn't know, an ICO is a cryptocurrency. It's like a IPO or an initial public offering, but on a cryptocurrency. By the way, I'm so into cryptocurrency, but anyway, please continue.
Yeah. I think like what the blockchain has demonstrated in terms of enabling this like distributed ledger concept is really inspiring, and I think has probably a huge role to play in this in the longer term.
Completely.
Yeah, but like initial coin offerings is why like Bitcoin blew up. It's because it was a way for startups to get around some of the securities laws so they could raise money from people who weren't filthy rich. So they could like kind of crowdsource money into their project very quickly. And I think like that speaks to me to a need for this like more direct, more distributed, more democratic way of like funding what is built. Right, what is innovated on. And up until now you had a lot of like this work being done by kind of venture capital firms and different angel investors, and they were sort of the experts in the industry, and they could decide, okay, like what you're doing makes sense, and they had a background in business and they understood if you were likely to succeed. But there seems to be this just like huge need from people who, for whatever reason, either weren't seen as innovative, maybe due to bias, maybe due to, just their perspective of the world versus the people who are funding them. But then there's also this like huge amount of people who are tired of like working in just giant hierarchical corporations, and they want to start their own business because they want autonomy. And then this idea of like getting money from venture capitalists who are going to like significantly reduce or get rid of your autonomy and like force you into these like really, really short-term profit driven goals and models of how you're running your business, like is really, really frustrating. And it's also really hard to convince them. There's only a few of them that have a lot of money. You have to get their attention. You have to put a lot of effort into like convincing them what you're doing is important. So I think like the initial coin offering offered people a way to raise money that was an alternative path. And a lot of people invested into these companies, which was fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So there was like, so there was like an appetite for it. And I think like, that's one example of the ways that our existing hierarchies are starting to be limiting. And I think like, so like those are the laws, right? The laws of how you build a company, how you fund a company, who's allowed to own shares, which is fairly centralized, and people seem to be like pushing against that boundary. And then there's like the actual infrastructure, like all the software we have right now is built for corporations. So like everything, even like when you're using Slack, like they're optimizing for corporations. So like for any group that's like decentralized, that's not like a top-down, massively funded corporation, like the permission structures aren't really quite right. The cost isn't prohibitive.
Right.
So if you think of like every other thing in our society, we're also like, everything is sort of like built for this hierarchical model. And as we're running into these things, like it seems to, I don't know, it seems to like people aren't satisfied with it or something, or it's just not working, or it's not how we want to work anymore. What do you think? Like,
yeah. So the one thing that's on my mind now is it's just everything is, so many things are built in with the assumed context of that you're in a hierarchical society with hierarchical organizations. And then another thing I thought just before that was you were talking about Slack. How it's built for organizations, and like when you build software like Slack, you're probably going to assume that there's going to be a leader or a CEO or something like that. And it's just, you're blind to this assumption. That's just how society works. You know, who else would you be building it for? And, but I completely agree. I think the model of command and control, or what Jordan Hall would call the blue church, the broadcast modality, I definitely feel like its time is, I feel like it's in senescence, you know, it's old, it's kind of showing its age. And and your example of sort of the securities laws limiting the ways that we invest in things is a perfect example of an old institution, a centralized institution trying to, I mean, from the perspective of that, let's say the SEC, they would say that they're protecting people. You know, I would question whether that's actually the intrinsic motivation. I would suggest it's more about power. Just generally for centralized entities, it's typically about power. And I don't know if this was exactly your point, but when I think about ICOs versus, let's say, the SEC, it's sort of, to me, it's like the water coming in through the cracks of the whole concept of centralized control. First of all, just being able to withstand the changes, and maybe more importantly, it's just that it's not fit for the environment anymore. Something like the SEC trying to control, you know, free engagements between people. So, but it's and then going back even further to what you were saying, we now have the technology to decentralize, to engage in these decentralized coordination games, let's say, but we don't really know how yet. And as you say, the software generally is built in a different assumption. So, I mean, for me, that, and I was actually, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, now I have a window into what drives you to work on the project you're working on, because it seems like that specifically is what you're thinking through. Like, how do you, let's say, serve the same kind of need as Slack, or what's another good example? Trello, maybe. but networking in general, and maybe you can get more specific about how that can be more specific. But yeah, in the context of there's not going to be a centralized organization, and there is a lot of value to be gained by identifying a problem and throwing like a decentralized grab bag of a bunch of actors where, okay, if I see a problem and I want to solve it and I want to use a decentralized network, the ideal for me would be to not have to think about the topology at all. And it almost sounds like that's kind of what you're trying to solve. How do you build a how do you build software to coordinate a decentralized network of related groups? That would almost invalidate, let's say, my role and my example of me saying, okay, let's do this. Like, there wouldn't need to be a me. Like, the decentralized network would kind of, naturally coordinate. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, yeah. How do you enable emergent structures? Yeah. And it's really, really fascinatingly unintuitive because the first thing that we discovered was, in order to decentralize power, you have to centralize coordination. So in order to decentralize power, you have to have everyone get
power,
access.
you have to centralize
coordination.
Sorry, we were talking coordination. Okay, and now I'm sorry,
so, like,
say what you just said again.
Yeah, so in order to decentralize power, everyone has to have access to the information, right? Because, like, why is the CEO the CEO? Why are they the ones that have the power? It's because they have access to the financial information. They have access to the organizational infrastructure and the kind of all the confidential files. They have status-based authority, which gives them a lot of ability to make quick decisions and to tell people what to do and make sure people aren't doing the wrong things, make sure people aren't doing the same things. But there's just a lot of things that actually could be shared, right? And as, like, these companies have been exploring things like sociocracy and holacracy, they're kind of pushing for transparency, because transparency gives more people more access to information, which means more people can think about the problem and maybe come up with a different solution or contribute to the solution without being asked to. So that's one thing, is like the relevant sort of information. The other thing that's really, so you have to, like, coordinate, you have to, like, centralize certain things, right? Like who's doing what has to be visible to everyone.
Right. So I would like to just sort of draw that together a little bit, because you're saying if you want a decentralized structure, maybe another example of what you're saying is like, okay, you want everyone to have all the information, but then you have to actually define what all the information is, which is kind of centralization. It's like you bring all the information here, and here's the information for everybody. Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah. And then you have to sort of figure out what is the coordinating information versus what is, like, private information that not everyone needs, right?
Right, you can't just throw a net around all of it and say, here you go, guys, because that's a mess to climb through, right?
Yeah, and then you can't have any sort of autonomy.
Right.
So there's sort of this, like, so that's the unintuitive thing that, you know, was sort of the first realization of, like, oh, you actually do need a lot of centralization of very specific things in order to have decentralized power. The second unintuitive thing was, like, oh, you actually need a good amount of hierarchy that's not status-based. So you need to have some respect of hierarchy of knowledge, expertise. You need to have some amount of respect around, like, roles. So you still need, like, people to understand their place in a given small group in order to contribute effectively. And the way you get around this like kind of oppression is that if you make it really easy for people to leave a group and start their own, and it's like a relatively cheap thing to do that's not super detrimental, then you can still have a lot of hierarchy to some extent or another. Like that's not necessarily status only. It's like, you know, I'm not going to necessarily tell my data architect how to build a data architecture database, right? And he's not necessarily going to tell me like something about business strategy, right? So we're going to like allow each other to have hierarchies of authority based on expertise or based on like, I chose to do this task, so I'm just going to like have the authority to do it. You know, and if someone else wants to do it, it's like they kind of have to like put the time in, but they're not putting the time in, so they don't get to tell me how to do my task, right? Yeah. So there's like a certain amount of need for hierarchy, and then there's also like a certain amount of need to make it like cheap and efficient to form new groups, so that if that hierarchy is being abused, you have a way to leave and start your own thing.
Right.
So it's kind of like a paradox in a way. It's like you need hierarchy and centralization of specific things that's really, really, really like effective in order to enable decentralization of other things.
Yeah, no, for sure. I get you completely. And like, just so I've been into cryptocurrency for, I think like 7 years now. And there's this kind of like decentralization is the highest value. But I think as people get more and more into it, they come to find out that, especially if they're going to try to build anything, that you have to settle with some amount of centralization. You can't really have a completely decentralized system. It's always going to have some centralizing aspects. In a way, now I'm just thinking you could call a smart contract a kind of centralization, because it's like the most, it can't evolve at all. No one had any say in it except for the guy who wrote the smart contract. There's no democracy there at all. But then that enables, paradoxically, this, you know, these different decentralized systems. And yeah, these paradoxes are really interesting. One of the speakers in, I think, the Rebel Wisdom Festival was talking about paradox as a route to like, well, the impression I get is that you always should pay attention to paradoxes, and they're not necessarily just some flaw. Like there could be quite a bit of value in paying attention to the paradox. And then the other one you mentioned was you're breaking down a large hierarchy, or you're saying we don't need a large hierarchy for this, but you kind of, if you're going to build this alternative that we're talking about, you need to kind of put mini hierarchies in or at least allow them to be built. Yeah, interesting stuff.
Micro hierarchies. It's funny you say that, because like I've been really struggling with the term decentralization and distributed because of that, because it's like, when I say it, I mean decentralization of status-based power.
Right.
So decentralization of like, I'm an authority just because I say I'm an authority, and I have power because I control something.
Right. And you're not saying that there's none of that. You're saying that you decentralize it. So you still have that, but it's way decentralized towards happening on a micro scale. Right.
Yeah. And to some extent, like you can arguably, like if you can have like different levels of decentralization, right? You can have a completely flat system where every person is completely autonomous, and then you can have like direct democracies where, you know, and then you can have like indirect democracies, like representative democracies, where there's like some mechanism of a feedback loop, but it might be a little delayed. And what we're talking about now almost feels like it's like a micro hierarchy. Like as long as no one piece of the system gets too big to get disproportionately powerful, you might end up having a hierarchy of the right types, like expertise hierarchies or
Yeah.
vetted, trusted, reputational hierarchies. As long as there's like an easy ability for that to be fluid, so that if it becomes corrupt, you can just move out of it and into something else.
Yeah.
I guess that's the hypothesis I'm sort of playing with, is like, if it's cheap enough to like you're saying, like create these infrastructures that are sort of underlying everything, and then you can like try and fail and change very cheaply and easily, like, does that prevent that stagnation that it seems like is like currently preventing us from moving forward as a global society in a lot of ways?
Yeah. Well, Jordan Peterson talks about hierarchies, and he says that they're useful competence hierarchies, let's say, but that any hierarchy has a tendency to ossify and start to become corrupt. And that's just kind of how they are. So what we're talking about now, the idea of building a sort of like a container, or like almost like a petri dish of hierarchies, where the hierarchies are free to form and break as they will, seems like a pretty good like solution to the problem, or container, or way to channel the inherent good of hierarchies.
Yeah, it turns out it's really, really, really hard work to build a platform.
Yeah, who'd have thought?
So,
Yeah,
especially in a
especially
way
when you're
that's like
questioning a bunch of the.
different.
I was just gonna say, yeah, if you're questioning all the axioms, and yeah, that introduces a lot of uh, complications, and that's like, I work in cryptocurrency, and that's how it is there too. When you're on the cutting edge, it gets complex.
Yeah, and like a lot of what we're doing is like in advance. So like we modeled a lot of our infrastructure based on decentralized organizations who are fairly successful. And then like a lot of the decisions we made were based on like interviews of like, what do they do now? What are they optimized for? For the most part, they tend to choose scalability over resilience.
Mm.
So when I say, are you worried about like something getting out or like privacy? And they are, except the way you get scale is through more and more transparency. So there's
Right.
this kind of like constant battle between scalability and resilience, because if something is completely resilient, it usually means it's incredibly like tightly controlled. So like you're never going to have anyone learn anything that they're not allowed to know, and everyone gets to kind of have a really, really good understanding of what the different boundaries are of information and who gets to see what. And you have a lot of trust built, and it takes a long time, but it's really resilient, because the chances of then somebody getting to the information that they shouldn't have is really low.
Huh.
So like the likelihood of it getting corrupted is really low.
Interesting.
But that's not very scalable.
Right. It's interesting.
So, yeah.
Just hearing you talk, it's almost like I imagine the information being like just like, almost like a lifeblood of these things. Like in a way, I get I get the sense that you have thought through this so much that you're seeing connections that I don't, or you have an intuition that I don't, because the way you talk about information, yeah, you're defining like resiliency and scalability in terms of information boundaries. It's just fascinating, and it just makes me think of information as like this lifeblood of a organization. It's interesting. I don't really have much of a point beyond that.
Yeah, no, I haven't really thought about it that way, like, but that's true, right? And that's kind of that centralization of the coordinating, like it, some people call it like the mycelial network of like, how do you get the nutrients to the right place at the right time? And if you restrict the nutrients, you're causing people to, not be able to proceed. So like blood, right? And like in general, in order to have more decentralization and more distributed power structures, you have to be able to take the risk. You have to take the risk that, yeah, it might get corrupted. You know, somebody might get a hold of that information
Yeah.
and not use it in the right way. Your competitor might get it, or you might have somebody say something that you don't like, you know, and those are sort of the risks you take to have scalability so that more people have access to it, because the assumption is that usually you get more people utilizing that information to help each other. And it's been really interesting too, because like a lot of these decentralized organizations that I've talked to say like the resilience sort of, you know, there is a balance to be struck. Like you don't necessarily want completely no boundaries at all, because then it's really way too easy for one person to come in, and any one person in the system can completely destroy the system. So you don't want that kind of fragility, even though it's infinitely scalable. But you also kind of, you don't want, you don't want to be so afraid of something going wrong that you're not like enabling people to do the work they need to do.
Yeah.
And I think like trying to find that balance is definitely one of the tricks of doing this well, but it's also interesting because like some of it is that this doesn't have to happen in the technology layer. So one of the things about like crypto that's really interesting to me is like, it always assumes that the technology layer has to be the arbitrator of all of these decisions.
Right, right.
And when I talk to these centralized organizations, and I'm like, yeah, but why do you put everything on a public Google Doc drive? Like, how is this resilient? And they're just like, because we know the people we're working with, and all of that trust building and resilience building and management happens off of the software. So by the time you get to the point where you like give someone a link, it's not such a big risk. So I think like part of it is like, you know, and kind of maybe to close this conversation out is like, I don't think the software is necessarily the end all be all and the only thing or the only answer to all these problems. I just think that like we need to be able to, at the very least not inhibit the natural kind of innovation and autonomous group formation and adaptation that people seem to naturally just want to do.
Yeah.
Like if we're not inhibiting it, I consider us successful.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this is like, they're going to have to do a lot of the governance offline too. Right?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm sort of, I have two major things going on in my life right now. One is the cryptocurrency thing, and we're building a DAO. Our sale actually goes live in less than 24 hours. So it's very immediate right now. And that's all about, you know, on the side of trying to get coordination through these hard smart contract rules. And then just a few weeks ago, I started trying to bring this community together. And what I've been noticing, it's eerie how a lot of this community is coming alive in a way that's bigger than me and is decentralized. So, but it's all, there's not, you know, a line of cryptocurrency isn't part of it. And yet that's where the decentralized concept came from for me. That's where I encountered it for the first time. And, but to get this entity like living and breathing and making its own decisions, so to speak, it's happening. We just all socially though. So that it's really been really interesting for me to see those two together now in parallel. Like, okay, we're trying to build this technically decentralized thing so that people can sort of anonymously make choices and filter up in a liquid democracy system actually. And then that's all theoretical and rule based, and it's really educating and inspiring to see that, oh, this can just happen socially, just in a community, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And not to say that there's no place, like, I mean, the things that like feel like do have to be like codified in technology to me are usually the things that need transparency and autonomy, right? So like voting is often that, banking, maybe not transparency always, but at least yeah, I guess no, transparency.
Mhm.
So the infrastructural things that sort of enable a distribution of power being decentralized in the actual technology itself seems extremely valuable. And like I'd imagine that like at some point, if we got to this like ideal place where we have like these social norms figured out and these like kind of resilient organizations that are like fluidly functioning, they will fundamentally at some point need some kind of like mechanism for accounting.
Yeah, yeah,
Whether that's
yeah,
accounting money or accounting votes or accounting something else.
right. Completely. Yeah, it's exciting. It'll be really cool to watch it come together, for sure.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, I learned a lot as well. So I hope that you send me like the link to your organization and like what you guys
Yeah,
are up to. I'm really fascinated by that stuff, and I think it's really
yeah,
exciting.
cool. I'll send you the links. And then for the viewers, I'll put some links down below for everything we've talked about. Um, yeah, I'm gonna stop record now and tell you thank you again.